You people always think you can get away with anything, do you? The flashing red and blue lights cut through the quiet night, like a blade, as Officer Ryan Cole stepped out of his patrol car, his hand already resting on his holster, his eyes locked on the woman behind the wheel, as if he had already decided who she was before she even spoke. The highway stretched empty for miles, the only sound the low hum of passing wind and the distant echo of tires. Against asphalt, Nia Brooks slowly rolled down her window, her movements calm, deliberate, the soft glow from the dashboard lighting her face. She did not look nervous. She did not look guilty. She looked composed, almost as if she had been expecting this. Ryan leaned down, his flashlight cutting sharply across her eyes. "You were swerving," he said, his voice cold, edged with accusation. "License and registration." Nia blinked, once adjusting to the harsh beam, her voice steady. "I was driving within the limit, officer." His jaw tightened at her tone, not submissive, not afraid, just controlled. That control seemed to irritate him more than anything. "Step out of the vehicle," he snapped, the words landing heavy in the silence. For a brief moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The wind slowed, the night deepened, and somewhere far behind them headlights flickered and disappeared. Nia opened the door and stepped out, her shoes touching the pavement with quiet confidence. She stood there facing him, not defiant, but unshaken, as if this moment was just another page in a story she had already read before. Continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Ryan circled the car slowly, his boots heavy against the asphalt, his flashlight scanning every inch as if searching for something that would justify what he had already decided. "You fit a description," he muttered, though there was no urgency in his voice, no radio call, no real evidence, just assumption. Nia watched him silently, her hands visible, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp, taking in every movement, every word, every shift in his tone. "You are searching for something that is not here," she said quietly. Ryan stopped, the beam of his light snapping back to her face. "You do not get to tell me what I am searching for." His voice rose, now edged with something deeper than authority, something personal, something rooted far beneath the badge. The air grew heavier, the distance between them charged with unspoken tension. Somewhere in the darkness, unseen, unnoticed, a second vehicle slowed, just enough to observe before continuing on its way, and Nia Brooks stood there in the glow of flashing lights, not as a victim, not as someone caught off guard, but as someone waiting for the exact moment when everything would change. Ryan Cole took a slow step closer, his boots scraping against the rough asphalt, the sound sharp in the quiet night, his flashlight no longer scanning the car, but fixed directly on Nia Brooks, as if the light itself could force a confession out of her face. There was something about the way she stood that unsettled him, not fear, not defiance, but a stillness that did not match the situation. Most people fidgeted, most people explained themselves too quickly, but she did neither. She simply watched him, and that silence pressed against his authority in a way he could not explain. "Turn around," he ordered, his tone harder, now his patience thinning. "Place your hands on the roof of the vehicle." Nia did not move right away, not because she was refusing, but because she was measuring the moment, the distance between them, the tone in his voice, the slight tremor in his grip on the flashlight. She turned slowly, placing her hands flat against the cool metal of the car, the surface still warm from the engine, her reflection faint under the flashing lights. Ryan stepped behind her, his presence close enough that she could hear his breathing, steady but edged with irritation. He began a search, methodical but unnecessarily rough, his hands pressing harder than required, as if proving a point. "You nervous?" he asked quietly, leaning closer, as though the question itself carried weight. "I am aware of what is happening," Nia replied, her voice even and controlled. He let out a short, dry laugh. "That is not what I asked." His hands paused at her wrist for a moment longer than needed, as if expecting resistance. But there was none, and somehow that lack of resistance irritated him more than anything else around them. The highway remained mostly empty, but the air no longer felt still. A faint glow appeared in the distance behind Ryan, headlights approaching slowly, not rushing, not hesitant, just present. Nia noticed it before he did, her eyes flicking slightly to the side, then back forward, her expression unchanged. Ryan stepped away, circling her again, his suspicion now feeding on itself. "I could take you in right now," he said, raising his voice slightly, as if speaking not just to her, but to the empty road as well. Failure to comply Obstruction, maybe even resisting, depending on how. This goes as words hung in the air, waiting for a reaction, waiting for fear. But Nia only turned her head, slightly meeting his eyes for the first time, without the barrier of light. If you believe that is necessary, officer, you should proceed. She said calmly. The sentence landed differently than he expected, not defensive, not pleading, but almost procedural, like she was giving him permission, and that unsettled him in a way he could not immediately understand. The approaching vehicle behind them slowed, its engine lowering to a quiet hum as it moved closer. The headlights now illuminating the scene from a different angle, casting longer shadows, stretching Ryan's figure across the pavement. He glanced back, briefly annoyed by the interruption, then returned his focus to Nia, his jaw tightening. "You think you are better than this," he said, his voice low now, almost personal. "I have seen people like you before thinking the rules do not apply." Nia took a slow breath, the cool night air steady in her lungs. "I follow the law," she replied. Simply, the words were not loud, but they carried a weight that did not belong. A roadside stop. Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "Something in the way," she said. "It's something in the way." She stood unshaken under pressure, planted a small seed of doubt deep beneath his certainty. He pushed it aside, quickly stepping forward again, reaching toward her bag inside the vehicle without asking permission. "I'm going to search your car," he declared, his voice louder. Now, reclaiming control, Nia lowered her hands from the roof, slowly, turning to face him fully, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged. "You should be very sure about that decision," she said quietly. There was no threat in her voice, no anger, no raised tone. But something else, something final, something that suggested this moment was not just another stop, not just another night. The second vehicle came to a complete stop a short distance behind them, its engine still running, its presence no longer subtle. The air shifted again, heavier, tighter, as if the night itself was preparing for what came next. And for the first time since the lights had appeared, Ryan Cole felt something unfamiliar press against his chest. Not fear, not yet, but the beginning of something he could not control. The engine behind them idled, low, steady, and patient, like it had all the time in the world. Ryan Cole turned his head again, this time holding his gaze on the second vehicle longer than before. The headlights were not blinding, they were controlled, angled, just enough to illuminate without drawing attention, and that detail alone was enough to make something tighten in his chest. He had been on enough stops to know the difference between a curious passerby and someone who was watching. This was not curiosity, this was intent. He turned back to Nia Brooks, his expression sharpening, as if trying to regain ground that had already begun to slip. "You think that car is here for you?" he asked, his tone edged with a challenge. But beneath it, there was something else, something thinner, less certain. Nia followed his glance only for a fraction of a second before returning her eyes to him. "I think you should focus on your decision, officer," she said quietly. Her voice had not changed, but the weight behind had it no longer sounded like a warning. It sounded like a boundary. Ryan exhaled sharply, pushing past the hesitation building in his mind. He reached into the car, through the open door, his hand brushing against the interior as he began to search. Without waiting for a response, the smell of leather and faint perfume filled the air as his flashlight cut across the passenger seat, the console, the floorboards. Everything was clean. Too clean, no clutter, no signs of anything out of place, which only seemed to frustrate him more because it left him with nothing to justify what he was already doing. His movements grew quicker, less precise, as he opened compartments, glanced inside, and closed them again with more force than necessary. "You people always act like you have nothing to hide," he muttered under his breath, though the words were loud enough to carry. Nia did not respond. She stood beside the car, her hands now resting loosely at her sides, her posture relaxed, but deliberate, her eyes tracking every movement he made, not with fear, but with attention, like someone observing a process they already understood. The second vehicle behind them shifted slightly, its headlights dimming for a moment before stabilizing again, as if adjusting to the scene. Ryan noticed that too, and this time he could not ignore it entirely. He straightened up from the car, his jaw tight, his mind beginning to work through possibilities. Dispatch had not mentioned another unit, no call had gone out, no request for backup had been made. So why was someone here? He stepped away from the open door, turning fully toward Nia again. "Who is that?" he demanded, gesturing toward the vehicle behind them. Nia tilted her head slightly as if, considering the question, though her expression gave nothing. "Oh, why does it matter?" she asked softly. The simplicity of the answer irritated him more than any defiance could have. He took a step closer, closing the distance between them, his voice dropping lower. "You're going to answer me." Now, the command hung heavy in the air, but it did not land the way he intended. Nia met his gaze directly, her eyes steady, unblinking. "I already have," she said. The wind picked up, slightly brushing across the open highway, carrying with it a faint sound from behind them, a car door opening, then closing, not rushed, not aggressive, just deliberate. Ryan turned again, more sharply, this time his hand instinctively moving closer to his belt as his attention split between the woman in front of him and the presence now stepping out of the shadows behind. He could hear footsteps, now measured, controlled, approaching, but not rushing, each step closing the distance with quiet authority. For the first time since the stop began, Ryan felt the situation shift in a way he could not immediately correct. This was no longer a simple traffic stop, no longer a moment he could dominate with volume and posture. Something else had entered the scene, something he did not initiate, something he did not control, and Nia Brooks stood there in the center of it all, calm, steady, watching, not like someone caught in a moment, but like someone who had been waiting for it all along. The footsteps came into the light, slowly, measured, and controlled, until a tall man in a dark jacket stepped just far enough in a view for his face to be seen, but not enough to fully reveal himself. His presence alone shifting the weight of the moment. Ryan Cole squared his shoulders, instinctively, his stance widening as he tried to reassert control over a situation that was no longer responding to him the way it had just minutes ago. "This is an active stop," he called out, his voice firm but sharper than before. "Identify yourself." The man did not answer immediately. He simply stood there watching, taking in the scene, the patrol car, the open vehicle, the position of Nia Brooks, and the tension hanging between them like a wire pulled too tight. Then he took another step forward and spoke calmly. "You seem to have everything under control, officer." The tone was neutral, but there was something beneath it, something that did not match a casual observer. Ryan felt it immediately, and it irritated him. "Who are you?" he repeated, louder this time, his authority pushing outward like a shield. The man reached into his jacket, slowly, not in a threatening way, but with deliberate clarity, and for a brief second Ryan's body tense, preparing for the worst, until the man produced a simple identification holder, but did not open it yet. "Just someone making sure everything is being handled properly," he said. Ryan scoffed, stepping forward, closing the distance slightly. "You can keep moving unless you are involved in this stop." The man held his position, unfazed, his eyes flicking briefly toward Nia before returning to Ryan. "That might be difficult," he said quietly. Ryan followed that glance, his irritation rising again as he turned back toward Nia, as if this was all somehow her doing. "You set this up," he accused, his voice low and sharp like a blade cutting through the air. Nia did not react immediately. She simply looked at him, her expression unchanged, her calm now almost unsettling in contrast to his growing frustration. "I did not set anything up, officer," she said softly. "You made your choices." The words landed heavier than they should have, and Ryan felt it, even if he refused to acknowledge it. He turned away from her again, focusing on the man behind him, his patience thinning fast enough. He snapped, "Show me your identification." Now the man finally opened the holder, just enough for Ryan to see, but not long enough to study it in detail, and that brief glimpse was enough to introduce something new into Ryan's mind. Not recognition, not yet, but a flicker of uncertainty. The man closed it again before Ryan could fully process it. "You should finish what you started," he said, calmly nodding toward the car. Ryan's jaw tightened. The control he thought he had was slipping through his fingers, and he did not like it, not one bit. He turned back to Nia, stepping closer again, his voice louder now, as if volume could restore order. "I told you, I'm searching this vehicle, and now I'm going to check everything, including the trunk." Nia watched him carefully, her eyes steady, her breathing. "Even if that is the decision you want to stand by," she said quietly, "then you should be absolutely certain." The words did not sound like resistance. They sounded like a line being drawn, and something about that line made Ryan hesitate for the briefest moment before he pushed through it. He moved toward the rear of the car, his hand reaching for the trunk, released the metal cool under his fingers as the red and blue lights continued to flash around them, casting sharp shadows across the pavement. The night felt different now, no longer empty, no longer neutral. It felt like a stage, and every movement carried weight behind him. The man in the dark jacket remained still, watching, not intervening, not interrupting, just observing, and that silent observation pressed harder on Ryan than any spoken warning ever could. As the trunk clicked open with a dull mechanical sound, Ryan felt it again, that strange, unfamiliar pressure building beneath his confidence, like something just beneath the surface waiting to break. And standing just a few feet away, Nia Brooks did not move, did not speak. She simply watched as the moment continued to unfold exactly as she had expected. The trunk lifted slowly, the hinges creaking under the weight of the moment, as much as the metal itself, and Ryan Cole leaned forward, his flashlight cutting through the darkness inside, expecting something, anything that would justify the path he had chosen. But what stared back at him was nothing out of place, no bags stuffed with contraband, no hidden compartments, no sign of anything illegal, just a neatly organized space, a small travel case, a folded jacket, and a sealed envelope resting flat against the lining. The beam of light lingered there longer than necessary, as if refusing to accept the simplicity of what he was seeing. His jaw tightened, his grip on the flashlight hardening as frustration began to replace certainty. Behind him, the quiet presence of the man in the dark jacket remained unchanged, watching without interference, and that silence pressed harder now, like a weight. Ryan reached into the trunk, pulling the envelope out without asking, his movements sharper, more deliberate, as if speed could mask doubt. He turned it over in his hands, the paper, thick, official looking, but still unopened. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice louder, now echoing slightly across the empty stretch of road. Nia Brooks took a step closer, not too fast, not aggressive, just enough to close the distance, her eyes fixed on the envelope and his hand documents. She said simply, "You should be careful with those." He scoffed, the sound dry and dismissive. "I will decide what I should be careful with," he snapped, tearing the seal open with a quick motion, the paper ripping louder than expected in the quiet night. He pulled out the contents, unfolding them under the beam of his flashlight, scanning quickly, his eyes moving over lines of text that did not immediately register, his brow furrowed, irritation flashing across his face, as if the words themselves were refusing to make sense. "This does not mean anything," he said too quickly, his tone defensive now rather than authoritative. "It means exactly what it says," Nia replied, her voice calm but firmer than before. Ryan looked up at her, his expression shifting for a fraction of a second, something uncertain flickering behind his eyes before he pushed it down again. "No," he said, shaking his head as if rejecting the possibility outright. "You do not get to tell me what this means." He glanced back at the man behind him, as if seeking confirmation, but the man offered none, only that same steady, unreadable gaze. Ryan turned back to the paper, scanning again, more carefully, this time slower, the words beginning to settle into place, phrases that carried weight, phrases that did not belong in the hands of someone he had just pulled over on an empty highway. His breathing changed, just slightly, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for the tension in his shoulders to tighten. He folded the paper once, then again, as if trying to contain it, as if folding it could reduce its significance. "This is not valid," he said, though the conviction in his voice had weakened. "You're going to step back from my vehicle," Nia said quietly, and this time there was no softness left in her tone. It was not a request, it was not a suggestion, it was instruction. Ryan looked at her fully, now really looked at her for the first time since the stop began, not just at her face, not just at her presence, but at the way she stood, the way she spoke, the way the moment seemed to bend slightly around her, and something inside him shifted, not completely, not enough to stop him, but enough to crack the certainty he had been holding on to. He laughed once, a short, hollow sound, trying to rebuild the ground beneath his feet. "You think a piece of paper changes anything?" he said, raising his voice again, trying to push past the doubt. "You're still being detained." Nia did not raise her voice. She did not step back. She simply held his gaze steady and unwavering. "Then you should be very sure you are ready for what comes next," she said. The wind moved through the open highway again, carrying the faint hum of the second vehicle behind them, still idling, still present, and for the first time since he had opened the trunk, Ryan Cole felt the situation slipping beyond his control, not in a sudden dramatic way, but in a slow, undeniable shift, like a tide, pulling back before something much larger arrives. Ryan Cole stood frozen for a moment longer than he realized, the folded document still in his hand, his mind racing through possibilities. He did not want to accept the words he had just read, echoing louder now than the silence around him. He exhaled sharply, as if forcing the doubt out of his chest, and stepped forward again, closing the distance between himself and Nia Brooks, his voice rising as he tried to regain control over a situation that no longer felt stable. "You think this changes anything?" he said, his tone sharper, louder. "You are still under investigation, and I am still the one in charge out here." The statement hung in the air, but it lacked the weight it had carried earlier. It sounded more like something he needed to believe rather than something that was true. Nia did not react to the volume. She did not step back. She did not raise her voice. She simply held her ground, her eyes steady. "On as you are not in control of this situation, officer," she said quietly, and that calm certainty cut deeper than any argument. Ryan's jaw tightened, his grip on the document loosening slightly, as if the paper itself had become heavier than before. Behind them, the man in the dark jacket shifted his stance just enough to signal presence. Without interrupting the moment, the low hum of the second vehicle still running a constant reminder that this was no longer a private encounter. Ryan turned abruptly toward the car, slamming the trunk shut harder than necessary, the sound echoing across the empty road like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence he refused to finish. He began pacing a few steps, his boots striking the pavement with controlled force, as if movement alone could bring him back into command. "I have seen this before," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "People trying to act important, trying to intimidate officers on duty." He stopped, turning back toward her, his expression hardening again. "You picked the wrong night for that." Nia watched him carefully, noting every shift, every crack forming beneath the surface. Her voice remained level, but there was a new firmness, now a line that had fully formed. "This is not about intimidation," she said. "This is about accountability." The words settled into the space between them, heavier than anything that had been said before, and Ryan felt it whether he wanted to or not. He let out a breath through his nose, his frustration now mixing with something unfamiliar, something that felt dangerously close to uncertainty. "You are not placing me under anything," he said quickly, almost reflexively, his voice stepping over hers, as if cutting her off could erase what had already been set in motion. "You do not have that authority." Nia did not argue. She did not raise her tone. She simply reached slowly into her jacket, her movement deliberate and unhurried. And for the first time since the stop began, Ryan's attention locked on her hands, not out of suspicion, but out of something closer to anticipation. The man behind them straightened slightly, his focus narrowing as the moment tightened around all three of them. Nia pulled out a small case, holding it at her side for a brief second before lifting it into the light, the red and blue flashes reflecting off its surface. But she did not open it, yet she did not reveal what was inside. Not immediately. Instead, she looked directly at Ryan, her gaze steady, unflinching. "You should have listened earlier," she said quietly. Ryan felt it, then the shift, not sudden, not explosive, but undeniable, like the ground beneath him had moved just enough to throw off his balance. He tried to speak, tried to push back, but the words did not come as easily as they had before, because somewhere beneath the noise, beneath the anger, beneath the certainty he had carried into the stop, there was now a question forming, one he could not ignore. What exactly had he just stepped into? The air grew heavier again, the silence stretching just long enough to make the moment feel suspended. And in that silence, Nia Brooks finally began to open the case. The small case clicked open with a soft, controlled sound that seemed to echo louder than it should have in the stillness of the highway. And for a brief second, nothing happened. Ryan Cole stood there staring at it, his mind caught between anticipation and denial as the red and blue lights reflected off the polished surface inside. Nia Brooks did not rush. She did not speak. She allowed the moment to stretch just long enough for the silence to settle into his chest before she turned the case slightly so the contents faced him clearly. A badge rested inside, not flashy, not oversized, but unmistakable. Its design precise, its lettering sharp, its authority quiet but absolute. Ryan's eyes locked onto it, and for the first time since the stop began, his expression faltered, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a subtle shift, the kind that begins in the eyes before it reaches the rest of The face, he leaned in slightly, as if distance could change what he was seeing, as if looking closer might reveal a flaw, a mistake, something that would restore the ground beneath his feet. But there was none. The badge did not belong to a local department. It was not something he could dismiss with a quick glance. It carried weight, the kind that did not need to be announced. Nia watched him carefully, her posture unchanged, her voice calm. When she finally spoke, "You asked who?" "I was," she said quietly now. You know, the words did not rise, they did not demand attention, but they landed with more force than anything he had heard all night. Ryan straightened slowly, the folded document still in his hand, the pieces beginning to align in a way he did not like. His grip tightened, then loosened again, as if unsure whether to hold on or let go. "This does not make sense," he said, his voice lower. Now, not as sharp, not as certain. Nia closed the case, but did not put it away. She held it at her side, her presence steady. "It does not have to make sense to you," she replied. "It only has to be real." Behind them, the man in the dark jacket stepped forward, just enough for his face to fully enter the light, his expression calm, his eyes focused on Ryan with a clarity that left little room for misunderstanding. The air shifted again, heavier, now more defined, the uncertainty that had been building, settling into something more concrete. Ryan glanced between them, his mind working quickly, searching for a way to regain control, to reframe the moment into something he could manage. "You should have identified yourself earlier," he said, finally reaching for the only argument he could find. This entire situation could have been avoided. Nia tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Where you could have followed procedure," she said simply, the sentence cut clean, leaving no space for defense. Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but paused, the words caught somewhere between instinct and realization, because deep down he knew the truth of it. This had not started with her. It had started with him, with a decision made in seconds based on something he could not justify. The flashing lights continued to pulse around them, painting the scene in alternating shades of red and blue, but the energy had changed completely. What had begun as a routine stop had become something else, something larger, something that no longer belonged to him. Ryan took a step back, almost without realizing it, the distance creating space not just between them, but between the authority he thought he held and the reality now standing in front of him. "You're saying this is official?" he asked, the question quieter, now stripped of its earlier edge. Nia met his gaze, and for the first time there was no softness left at all. "This has been official longer than you realize," she said, the words settled into him heavier than anything before. And in that moment, Ryan Cole felt it fully, the shift from control to consequence, from certainty to exposure. And standing there under the flashing lights, he understood something he had not considered when he first turned on a siren. This was never just a stop. This was the moment everything began to unravel. The silence after her words did not feel empty. It felt loaded, like something waiting just beneath the surface, ready to break. At any second, Ryan Cole stood there, his chest rising and falling a little faster than before, his eyes flicking once more to the badge, then back to Nia Brooks, as if hoping the image would change if he looked at it from a different angle. But it did not change. It remained steady, undeniable, real. He swallowed, once the motion subtle, but enough to betray the shift happening inside him. "This has been official longer than you realize," her words echoed again in his mind, louder, now heavier. And with each passing second, they settled deeper. Ryan took another step back, this time intentionally creating space, not just physically, but mentally, trying to put distance between himself and the realization forming in front of him. "You're saying this was planned?" he asked, his voice quieter, now stripped of its earlier force. Nia did not answer right away. She let the question sit between them just long enough to make him feel it, to make him understand that the answer was not something she needed to rush. Finally, she spoke. "This was observed," she said calmly. "Your actions were your own choice." That distinction landed harder than any accusation could have, because it left him with nothing to deflect, nothing to argue against. It meant there was no trap, no setup, no manipulation, only a moment. And the way he chose to handle it, Ryan shook his head slightly, as if rejecting the idea, even as it took hold. "No, that is not how this works," he said, trying to rebuild the structure of authority he had relied on for years. "You do not just appear out here in the middle of nowhere and start evaluating officers like this." Nia watched him steadily, her expression unchanged. "It may feel sudden to you," she said, "but it did not begin tonight." The words hung in the air, and something in them shifted the weight of the entire situation, not just a single stop, not just a single decision, but something ongoing, something that had been moving long before he turned on his lights. Behind them, the man in the dark jacket stepped closer. Now, no longer a distant observer, but a clear presence standing just within the circle of flashing light. His posture relaxed, but attentive, his eyes never leaving Ryan. The second vehicle remained idling, its headlights now dimmed slightly, as if the need for visibility had passed and control had already been established. Ryan glanced toward the vehicle, then back to Nia, his mind racing through every stop, every report, every moment that might have led here. "You do not have anything on me," he said quickly, the words coming out faster than he intended, as if speaking them could make them true. "You do not have cause for this." Nia took a slow breath, her gaze steady. "Unwavering cause is not always what you think it is," she replied softly. "Sometimes it is a pattern." The word pattern seemed to echo in the space between them, expanding beyond the moment, beyond the road, beyond the flashing lights. Ryan felt it settle into him, like something he could not shake, something that reached back further than this night, further than this stop. He let out a breath through his nose, his shoulders tightening again. "You are making assumptions," he said, but the conviction in his voice was thinning now, stretched by the weight of everything that had been revealed. Nia shook her head slightly. "Not assumptions," she said, "observations." The difference was small in sound, but massive in meaning, and Ryan understood that. Whether he wanted to or not, he looked down at the folded document still in his hand, then back at her, then at the man behind her. The pieces no longer scattered, but aligning into something clear, something unavoidable. The highway around them remained quiet, the world beyond this moment unaware of what was unfolding. But within that small space, under the flashing lights, everything had changed. Ryan Cole had begun the night believing he was in control, believing he could define the situation, the outcome, the narrative, but now, standing there with the truth no longer hidden, he realized something far more unsettling. This was never his moment to control. It was his moment to be seen. Ryan Cole stood still longer than he should have, the weight of the moment pressing into him from every direction, the flashing lights, no longer feeling like a symbol of authority, but something else, something exposing, something that made every movement, every word feel amplified under a spotlight he never asked for. He looked at Nia Brooks again, searching her face for something that would bring the situation back into something familiar, something he could control. But there was nothing there, no anger, no fear, no satisfaction, just a steady presence that did not need to prove anything. "This is not over," he said finally, his voice returning with a forced edge, as if pulling himself back together piece by piece. "You cannot just decide something like this out here on the side of the road. There's a process. There are steps you have to follow." The words came out stronger this time, more structured, more official. And for a brief moment, it sounded like the Ryan from earlier, the one who believed the system would always stand behind him. Nia listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her posture grounded, as if the ground beneath her feet had never shifted. "There is a process," she said calmly, "and it has already begun." Ryan shook his head quickly, almost immediately rejecting that idea. "No, you do not get to say that," he replied, his voice rising again. "You do not get to make that call." He gestured toward the empty highway, as if pointing out the isolation, the lack of witnesses, the absence of a formal setting. "This is not a courtroom. This is not an investigation room. This is just a stop." Nia took a slow step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to close the space between them. And with that single movement, the energy shifted again. "It may look like a stop to you," she said quietly, "but it is not just a stop." The words landed differently this time, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact, something already set in motion, something that did not require his agreement. Ryan felt at the subtle shift beneath the surface, the sense that something larger was already moving beyond his reach, and that realization made him push back harder. He let out a breath through his nose, his shoulders squaring again, as he tried to rebuild control. "You are still here," he said, pointing toward her car. "You are still under my authority until this is resolved. That is how this works. That is how it has always worked." The insistence in his voice carried more force than before, but underneath it, there was strain, something stretched too thin, something close to breaking. Nia held his gaze steady, her eyes calm, but unyielding. "That is how it worked before," she said softly. "Not now." The difference intense, the quiet shift from past to present cut deeper, Then any raised voice could have Ryan open his mouth to respond, but pause the words catching in his throat, because for the first time he could not immediately find a way to contradict the man in the dark jacket stepped forward, then closing the remaining distance until he stood just behind Nia, his presence no longer subtle, no longer distant, but fully part of the moment. He spoke for the first time with clear authority. "Officer Cole, you need to step back." His voice was calm, but carried a weight that did not invite argument. Ryan turned sharply toward him, his frustration flaring again. "You do not give me orders." He snapped, his tone defensive now, rather than commanding. The man did not react to the tone. He simply held his position. "You are being instructed to step back," he repeated. Ryan hesitated, the instinct to push forward. Still strong, but something held him in place, something deeper than fear, something closer to realization. He glanced between them again. Nia, standing calm, unshaken, a man behind her steady and unmoved, the second vehicle idling in quiet support, and for a brief moment everything aligned in a way he could not ignore. This was not his scene anymore. This was not his call to make. The control he had started with had not been taken from him. It had been outgrown by something larger, something already in motion before he ever stepped out of his car. And yet, even as that realization settled in, Ryan Cole made one last attempt to hold on to what he thought he still had. "This is not finished," he said again, quieter this time, but more deliberate. His eyes fixed on Nia, as if trying to anchor himself to something familiar. "You are not walking away from this." Nia met his gaze without hesitation, her voice calm but final. "No, officer," she said, "you are not walking away from this." The words settled into the air, like a final line drawn across something that could not be undone, and for a moment Ryan Cole did not move. He did not speak. He simply stood there staring at Nia Brooks, as if trying to force the moment to reverse itself, as if denial alone could shift reality back into something familiar. But it did not shift, it held firm, and in that stillness something inside him began to fracture, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet, controlled way, the kind that happens when certainty collapses from within. "You do not get to decide that," he said finally, his voice lower now, but carrying a sharper edge. One last attempt to push back against what was unfolding. "You do not get to stand here and tell me what I am or am not walking away from the man behind." Nia stepped forward again, this time closing the final distance until he stood directly within the space between them, his presence no longer optional, no longer something Ryan could ignore. "Officer Cole," he said, his tone calm but firm, "you are being directed to disengage from this. Stop and step back immediately." Ryan turned toward him quickly, his frustration rising again, but this time it did not carry the same weight. It felt thinner, stretched by everything that had already happened. "I am not disengaging from anything," he replied. "You have no authority over this scene." The man held his gaze without flinching, without raising his voice, without needing to prove anything. "That is where you are mistaken," he said quietly, and with that he reached into his jacket again, this time opening his identification fully and holding it steady long enough for Ryan to read it clearly. There was no quick flash, no ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation. The name, the department, the seal, all of it aligned with what Ryan had already begun to suspect, but had refused to accept. His eyes moved across the identification once, then again, slower this time, as if repetition might change the meaning, but it only made it clearer. The silence stretched again, heavier than before, and Ryan felt it settle into his chest like something final. "You're telling me this is a federal oversight action," he said, the words coming out slower now, as if each one required effort. The man lowered the identification, but did not put away. "This has been an active review for some time," he replied. "Tonight was simply part of that process." Ryan let out a breath, his shoulders tightening, then dropping slightly, as if the energy he had been holding on to was beginning to drain away. He looked at Nia again, really looked this time, not as a subject, not as a problem to solve, but as someone who had been standing in a different position all along, someone who had never been under his control, even when he believed she was. "You could have said something." He muttered the words quieter now, less accusation, more reflection. Nia shook her head slightly, her gaze steady. "That was not my role," she said. "Your actions were yours." The statement landed clean, leaving no space for argument. And Ryan knew it. He had made every decision himself, every word, every step, every escalation. None of it had been forced, none of it had been guided. And now all of it was being reflected back at him in a way he could not avoid. The flashing lights continued to pulse, but they no longer felt like as they felt distant, like something he was standing inside, rather than controlling the man in the dark. Jacket took a step closer, his voice steady. Officer Cole, you need to place your hands where I can see them and step away from the vehicle. The instruction was clear, direct, and final. Ryan hesitated, not because he did not understand, but because the meaning of it had fully settled. And now this was no longer a conversation. This was no longer something he could argue his way out of. This was consequence unfolding in real time. He looked down briefly at his hands, then back up at Nia, then at the man, and for the first time since the stop began, there was no resistance left in his posture, only a quiet recognition of what had already been set in motion. He slowly raised his hands, the movement. Controlled, deliberate, the same kind of control he had used earlier. Now turned inward as he stepped back away from the vehicle, away from the position he had held just minutes ago. And in that single motion, the balance of power shifted completely, no longer implied, no longer building, but fully realized under the flashing lights on an empty stretch of road where everything had changed. The sound of movement behind him came first, not rushed, not chaotic, but controlled, deliberate footsteps closing in with quiet authority, and within seconds, two more figures stepped out. From a second vehicle, their presence calm, coordinated, and unmistakably aligned with the man who had taken control of the scene. Ryan Cole stood with his hands raised, the weight of the moment settling fully into his posture, his shoulders no longer square in dominance, but held in a careful stillness that spoke of something else, something closer to realization than resistance. The flashing lights from his own patrol car continued to pulse across the pavement, reflecting off the badges now visible on the approaching agents. Their expressions focused, their movements precise. One of them moved to Ryan's left side, while the other positioned to his right, maintaining distance, but making it clear that the space around him was no longer his to command. Sir, keep your hands where they are, the agent on his left said, his voice calm, steady, practiced. Ryan did not argue. He did not turn. He did not attempt to reclaim anything, because by now he understood that the moment for that had passed. He kept his gaze forward, his breathing measured, though not as controlled as before. The edges of the situation finally catching up to him. The man in the dark jacket stepped closer, now standing directly in front of him, his presence anchoring the moment. Officer Ryan Cole, he said clearly, you are being placed under administrative detainment pending further investigation related to conduct and procedural violations. Ryan blinked, once the words registering not as a shock, but as confirmation of what had already been building throughout the night. Administrative detainment, he repeated quietly, as if testing the weight of the phrase in his own voice. The man gave a slight nod. This is a formal action. Your cooperation is expected. Ryan exhaled slowly, his chest rising then falling as the last pieces settled into place around him, his eyes flicking briefly toward Nia Brooks, who remained where she had been standing, calm, composed. Her role, now fully visible, without needing to be explained. This is because of tonight, he said, his voice lower, now less defensive, more searching. Nia shook her head slightly, her gaze steady. This includes tonight, she replied, but it does not begin here. The distinction landed clearly, and Ryan felt it not as an accusation, but as a realization, something that reached back beyond the stop, beyond the highway, beyond this moment of exposure. He looked down for a brief second, then back up as the agent on his left stepped closer, gently but firmly guiding his wrists together. Behind his back, the motion was controlled, professional, not aggressive, but it carried a finality that could not be ignored. The soft click of restraints echoed in the quiet night, a sound that felt louder than it should have, marking the complete shift from authority to accountability. Ryan closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, then opened them again, the world in front of him unchanged, but no longer his to define. The man in the dark jacket stepped slightly to the side, allowing the other agents to complete the process, while he turned his attention briefly toward Nia, a subtle acknowledgement passing between them, not spoken, not announced, but understood. This was not about spectacle, this was not about revenge, it was about process, about something that had been moving long before this moment and would continue long after it. The agents began to guide Ryan toward the second vehicle, his steps, steady though slower than before, each movement deliberate. As if he were fully aware of the weight behind it. He did not resist, he did not speak, he simply moved forward, the flashing lights fading slightly behind him as he stepped out of the position he had once controlled, and standing there under the dimming glow of red and blue. Nia Brooks remained still, her presence unchanged, her gaze following the moment, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, because what had just happened was not the end of anything. It was the point where the truth finally stepped into the light. The night seemed quieter now, not because the world had changed, but because the tension that once filled it had shifted into something heavier. Something settled Ryan. Cole was guided toward the second vehicle, his steps steady but slower, as if each one carried the weight of everything that had just unfolded. The agents remained professional, their movements controlled, their voices low and precise as they opened the rear door and positioned him inside. Without force, without spectacle, just procedure. The door closed with a firm sound that echoed briefly across the empty highway, marking a boundary that could not be undone. The flashing lights from his patrol car continued to pulse behind him, but now they felt distant, disconnected from the authority they once represented. Inside the vehicle, Ryan sat still, his hands secure behind him, his gaze fixed forward, not on anything in particular, but on the space ahead where the moment had already passed, and something else had begun to take its place. Outside, Nia Brooks remained where she stood, the cool air moving gently around her as the scene settled into a new rhythm, one no longer driven by conflict, but by resolution. The man in the dark jacket stepped beside her, his posture relaxed. Now that the situation had fully transitioned, his voice quieter. When he spoke, "It is done here." Nia gave a small nod, her eyes still on the vehicle where Ryan sat. "It is done here," she replied, "but it is not finished." The words carried a quiet certainty, not dramatic, not forceful, just true. The man glanced toward the agents as they began to move with quiet efficiency. One of them returning to Ryan patrol car, another speaking softly into a communication device, relaying details that would extend far beyond the stretch of road. The system was already moving, already responding, already continuing the process that had brought them here in the first place. Nia took a slow breath, the night air steady and cool filling her lungs as she allowed the moment to settle fully, not as a victory, not as something to celebrate, but as a necessary step in something larger, something that did not end with a single stop or a single officer. The man beside her spoke again, his tone measured. "This will move quickly now. There are other cases connected, other reports that will need to be reviewed." Nia nodded, once her gaze shifting briefly toward the highway, stretching out into the darkness before returning to the scene. In front of her, "It always does," she said. "Patterns do not stay hidden forever." Behind them, one of the agents approached, holding a small device, the faint glow of its screen reflecting in the low light. "Everything has been recorded," he said quietly, "the audio, the interaction, the search, the statements. It is all documented." Nia acknowledged him with a slight nod. "That is all we need," she replied, because in the end it was never about a single moment. It was about the accumulation of moments, the choices made when no one was supposed to be watching, the decisions that revealed more than any report ever could. The agent returned to his position, and within moments the second vehicle began to prepare for departure, the engine shifting from idle to readiness, the headlights adjusting slightly as if aligning with the road. Ahead, the patrol car remained behind, its lights still flashing, but now serving as nothing more than a marker of where something had changed rather than something that held control. Nia looked once more toward the vehicle where Ryan sat, not with judgment, not with anger, but with clarity, because what had happened here was not personal. It was structural. It was the result of a system correcting itself in the only way it could, through exposure, through accountability, through truth. The man in the dark jacket turned slightly, gesturing toward the vehicle that would carry them forward. "We should go," he said. Nia gave one final glance at the empty stretch of highway, the silence now different from before, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but resolve. Then she turned and walked with him toward the waiting vehicle, her steps steady, her posture unchanged as she moved forward into what came next. And behind them, the flashing lights continued for a few moments longer before finally dimming, leaving the road as it had always been, quiet, open, and unchanged except for the fact that something important had just been revealed. The highway returned to silence But the silence was no longer the same as before. It carried the echo of what had happened, the kind of echo that does not fade because it changes something beneath the surface. The patrol car lights had gone dark, the road, now lit only by distant street lamps and the faint glow of passing traffic miles away, as if the world had moved on, without noticing what had just been corrected. Inside the transport vehicle, Ryan Cole sat still, his hands secured, his posture no longer rigid with authority, but held in a quiet tension that came from understanding something. He had spent years avoiding. His eyes stared forward, but his mind was no longer on the road ahead. It was behind him, replaying the moment, the stop, the words, the tone, the assumptions, the choices, each one now standing clearer than they had in the moment. Because now there was nothing left to defend them against the system he believed would protect him had not turned against him. It had simply turned toward him. And for the first time, he was not the one asking questions. He was the one being answered at the federal facility. The transition was seamless, no raised voices, no spectacle, no chaos, just doors opening and closing with quiet precision as Ryan was escorted inside, the fluorescent lights above casting a neutral glow that stripped away the last traces of the roadside encounter. There were no flashing lights here, no stage, no audience, only process, only documentation, only truth recorded without emotion. He was seated across from a table, not as an officer, not as someone in control, but as a subject of review, and for the first time, there was no uniform to shield him from what came next. Hours passed, not marked by clocks, but by questions, by recordings, by reports being placed one after another in front of him, each one connecting to the next, each one forming a pattern that could no longer be ignored. It was not just one stop, not just one night, not just one decision. It was a series of repetition, a consistency that spoke louder than any explanation he could offer. And in another room, Nia Brooks stood with a file in her hand, her expression calm, her posture unchanged as she reviewed the final summary, the same steadiness she had carried on the highway, now present here, not because the moment demanded it, but because it defined her. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply acknowledged what had been confirmed. The man in the dark jacket stepped beside her, his voice low but certain. It is complete. Nia nodded, once her eyes scanning the last page before closing the file with quiet finality. Then it moves forward, she replied in it. Did the following days carry the outcome beyond that quiet room, beyond the empty highway, beyond the moment that had begun it all? Administrative action became formal charges, internal reviews expanded into broader investigations, and the pattern that had once been hidden within routine stops was now documented, undeniable, and addressed not in anger, but in process, in truth, in accountability, and somewhere far from the road. Where it all began, the story settled into something simple, something clear. He thought he was in control because he wore the badge, but that night he learned something he could not undo. The badge was never meant to give him power over people. It was meant to hold him accountable to them. And when he forgot that the system did not need to shout, it only needed to reveal the truth, and the truth did the rest.